The final speaker of our morning program, before our headliner event at lunch, is Brink Lindsey from the Niskanan Institute, and he's going to talk to us about capitalism's Achilles heel.
Thanks, Bob, and to the O'Neill Center for inviting me. Thanks all of you for coming. Sorry to say it, but welcome to the Debbie Downer portion of the program. First off, I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch, and we're running late. Second, no slides except this one, so nothing to distract from your mounting hunger pains except my dulcet baritone. And then thirdly, I'm talking about the dark side of capitalism and how things can go wrong. We heard from Jim Otteson and Michael Cox of the enormous creative power of capitalism and of competitive markets. What I want to dwell on is how all of that can go wrong and self-destruct. So first, a little Greek mythology lesson. Achilles was a fabled Greek hero of the Trojan War, immensely strong, virtually unbeatable, the son of a king and a sea nymph who was immortal, Thetis. She wanted her son to be immortal too, so she dipped him in the river Styx, which was supposed to do the trick, but she held him by the ankle. And so there was one little portion of his heel that was not coated in those waters, and sooner or later, in the end of the Trojan War, sneaky Paris, guided by Apollo, shot an arrow right into his heel, and that doesn't sound fatal, but no antibiotics back then, so. So you have the same way, capitalism, this immensely powerful force for good. Well, Achilles was an immensely powerful force for good for Greeks, not so much if you're a Trojan, but capitalism an immensely powerful force for good for everybody, and yet it has a vulnerability. And that vulnerability is that capitalism doesn't just happen spontaneously. It has to be institutionalized. The kinds of modern markets that unite, mobilize, and coordinate large numbers of people across geographic space and across long time horizons don't just spontaneously organize. They need to be embedded in institutions and laws and policies that help to coordinate people's expectations, to allow utter strangers to trust each other for big dollar, long-term propositions. And those institutions have to be set up right. If they're set up right, if the rules are written and enforced correctly, you get Adam Smith's invisible hand, because the rules are structured so that what is in the business person's self-interest leads him or her to serve others and therefore serve the public interest. But if those rules are not written correctly or not enforced correctly, then there is no necessary invisible hand, and the pursuit of private profit can occur at the expense of the rest of us rather than to our benefit. This is not a new observation. Going back again to be the dark side of Jim Otteson, let me go back to, he quoted Adam Smith a lot. Let me quote Adam Smith. At the dawn of modern capitalism, Smith had this less well-known quote, but well-known in some circles. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So Adam Smith knew that that business people could see that under the rules as they existed, they were hemmed in and had to compete with each other and had to think about their customers. But if they could just fiddle with the rules or flout the rules, then life would be a lot easier, and they could benefit themselves without having to worry about benefiting other people at the same time. So this is the deep, basic structural vulnerability of capitalism. It depends on good institutions, but those institutions don't make themselves. And in fact, all the actors in those institutions have incentives to degrade, tear apart, and undermine those institutions for their private gain. This is an insight that has been developed and articulated and fleshed out considerably in recent decades. Well known to people on the conservative, libertarian, free market side of things in the domain of what's called public choice economics. In particular, the insights of Mansur Olson, are kind of the master key to figuring out how things can go wrong, and that is that in democracy is ruled by the organized. If you're not well organized, if you don't show up, if you don't lobby, if you don't squeak your wheel, you get rolled. The fact is that it's not easy to organize. There are collective action problems. Why organize to lobby for this if other guys will do it and I can free ride off their efforts? So it turns out that it's much easier to organize if you're a small cohesive group than it is if you're a large dispersed group. And that gives small concentrated groups who want to conspire against the public interest a leg up in organizing against consumers and taxpayers who might collectively be fleeced to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars, but each of them only has a few bucks in the game, and that's not enough to motivate them to fight back. Despite the fact that Adam Smith, hero of free marketeers everywhere, and this body of public choice economics have been beating this drum of the vulnerability of capitalism to institutional degradation. It's been the curious lot of people on the conservative, libertarian, free market side throughout most of my adult lifetime to kind of put that aside and defend American actually existing capitalism today as a model of well-functioning market economy. How did that happen? It happened first because you had the Reagan-Thatcher revolution in the late 70s, early 80s, and they were changing economic policies, and free marketeers wanted to support them. Progressives and people on the left wanted to trash the economic performance of the UK and US economies after those reforms, and so free marketeers got in the habit of defending American capitalism. That ramped up a lot after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when US capitalism generally won the great ideological competition with communism, and the basic fundamental superiority of market economies over planned economies was a brute fact that no one could ignore any longer. Meanwhile, within the world of capitalist economies, the US during the 90s seemed to leave in the dust its major competitors. First, people had been worried about Japan Inc. And its sort of managed trade and industrial policy supplanting US more market-oriented economy, but the Japanese bubble burst in the early 90s, so that deepened our sense that our model was correct. Meanwhile, we had the internet boom and sort of opening up these dazzling new horizons for economic opportunity during the 90s, while Europe, with its social democracy, was struggling with chronic double-digit unemployment. So it is understandable that folks got the impression that we were at the end of history, that there was this one model towards which all the world was converging at varying speeds, to be sure, but all going in that direction, and that model was basically American capitalism. But then over the past decade, since the Great Recession, things have looked different. First, we had that crisis, but then it's really the aftermath that has led people to shift their perspective, and we're seeing that U.S. economic performance is faltering in critical and important ways. First, most obviously, economic growth in terms of real GDP per capita has fallen off considerably. So that during the 20th century, the average rate of GDP per capita growth was 2%. And so far in the 21st century, it's about 1%. So growth has fallen in half in this century compared to last. Meanwhile, if you just look at GDP numbers, that overstates how well most people are doing, because at the same time that we've had this slowdown in GDP growth, we've also had a rise in income inequality, so that what growth there is, a larger portion of it is going to a smaller sector of folks at the top, rather than being more widely distributed as it was in the past. This leaves a lot of people being sort of left behind by general economic progress or struggling just to keep their head above water. So the impression of American capitalism being a rising tide that lifts all boats was one that seemed intuitive and obvious in the 90s, much less so in recent years. And finally, we were seeing not just sort of these measures of economic performance softening, but also the kind of what we think of as the engine of economic performance also degrading. That is, economic dynamism, the churn of capitalism, seems to be slowing down. The percentage, the growth rate, or the birth rate for new businesses has been in secular decline now for decades. The rate at which new businesses grow has also been falling. The churn with which people shift to new jobs has been slowing. The shift with which people move, the rate at which people move to different parts of the country is slowing down. So in general, it looks like the U.S. economy is losing its mojo. There's a lot of things going on to explain both slowing growth and rising inequality. But one part of the story, I believe, and I co-wrote a book about it, is this vulnerability of capitalism to self-destruction by interested lobbying and what economists call rent-seeking. That is, narrow interests trying to rewrite the rules to benefit them at the expense of everybody else. So the book, which I co-wrote with Steve Tellis, who's a political scientist at Johns Hopkins and a colleague of mine at the Niskanan Center, the book is called The Captured Economy, How the Powerful Enrich Themselves, Slow Down Growth, and Increase Inequality. I will allude to things in the book a little bit, but I encourage you, if you want a fuller story of what I'm talking about, to take a look. In the book, we look at 4 case studies of big areas of policy or where we think rent-seeking or distortion of the rules has occurred in a way that both slows down or distorts competition and innovation, and does so in a way that redistributes income and wealth up the socioeconomic scale. So sort of regressive redistribution through the regulatory process in a way that throws sand in the gears of creative destruction, innovation, and growth. The 4 areas we look at: 2 at the federal level, financial regulation; secondly, intellectual property protection; at the state and local level, occupational licensing and zoning or land use. We can get into details about all of those areas and what's wrong with them, but just very briefly, the financial sector, it's obvious we had a major dysfunction 10 years ago, a cataclysm that nearly tanked the whole world economy. I think at the root of that is enormous government subsidies for excessive risk-taking and in general for borrowing and for credit. We have a much larger financial sector than we would in the absence of financial sector rent-seeking and government acquiescence in that rent-seeking. For intellectual property, we've had enormous growth in the kind of scope and of protection for patents and copyrights, which are temporary monopolies that are designed to encourage innovation or creative expression by giving the copyright or patent owner a temporary monopoly, raising the rates of return for innovation or creative expression, and therefore supposedly helping all of us in the long term. But as these monopolies have grown broader in scope and longer in duration, I think that balance has flipped, and so that now the main effect of intellectual property protection is to deter rather than to encourage innovation. Occupational licensing, the getting government permission before you can do your job, that's been the case for lawyers and doctors for a long time, but we've seen a real metastasis of occupational licensing in the past 30 years or so, 30, 40 years. So in 1970, about 10% of people worked in jobs that were subject to compulsory licensing. Now it's closer to 30%. And most of that has been driven by a huge expansion in the number of occupations, from massage therapists and yoga instructors to beekeepers and librarians, and even Louisiana, just Louisiana regulates florists, so protecting consumers against the horrible contingency of, a bad bouquet. And then finally, zoning, which we've had for a long time, for about 100 years, but since about the 1970s, first and most prominently on the coasts, but spreading, we've seen zoning not only affecting where housing is located in a metro area. It was always designed to do that. But now it's actually having an impact on how much housing is built in a metro area, and it's deterring it. And so we're seeing a huge run-up in prices in the most attractive urban areas because of these artificial supply constraints. Ed Glazer, an economist at Harvard, calculates this regulatory tax, the percentage of housing prices due to the regulatory permission to build in DC and Boston. It's about 20%. In Oakland and LA, it's about 30%. In San Francisco, San Jose, and Manhattan, it's upwards of 50%. So those are the four policy areas we look at. The sort of immediate question is, well, are these a big deal? Does this really matter? Are these, we've always had lousy policies, but are these really cashing out in terms of serious damage to U.S. economic prospects? And I would say that they are. And one way to look at it is to look at three sort of massive misallocations of resources that are plaguing the U.S. economy today. That if those misallocations were righted or unwound, we could have considerably higher output than we do today. And in the transition of unwinding those misallocations, we could have faster growth to get to that new higher level of output. First, the financial sector. Our financial sector is too big. There's a lot of research that points to how financial sector growth can be good for an economy. And for sure that is the case. That research looked heavily at less developed countries where financial repression had kept financial intermediation very low, and it's quite clear that as that kind of repression is relaxed and as financial sectors grow in less developed economies, that's a great engine for growth and for dynamism. In the past 10 years, people have looked at the other side of the equation. Is it possible, when you look at advanced economies, that you can get to a point of excess? So is there kind of a inverted U-curve of the relationship between a financial sector size and growth? And there is growing research to show that at a rough line of credit to the private sector equal to 100% of GDP, when you get to the high side of that, you're starting to see lower performance in productivity growth and higher vulnerability to cataclysm. We're well to the excessive side of that, right? I think we peaked around 200% right before the crisis, and now we're about 190%. Ducked down to 180, but we're climbing back. This excessive financial sector is, as I said, misallocating capital towards the kinds of institutions that financial institutions like to fund, and it is misallocating the best and brightest from building a better mousetraps to regulatory arbitrage in finance. So it has a big cost. Meanwhile, we have a huge misallocation of resources in healthcare. We spend 17% of GDP on healthcare, and nobody else does. Nobody else comes close. And we don't have great, life expectancy, mortality stats to show for it either. So it seems that something like maybe a third of U.S. healthcare spending is a waste of money. So a third of 17%, that's a lot of GDP that's being wasted. And why is that? There's a lot going on, but the power of the U.S. medical profession to not only ramp up income through occupational licensing, but also to structure social insurance payments, Medicare payments, to benefit them, to preserve a fee-for-service model, which then serves as the model for private insurers and how they structure compensation for care. That capture of that very subterranean, boring, complex process means that U.S. doctors get a lot more money than their counterparts anywhere else. Meanwhile, IP, intellectual property patents for pharmaceuticals. Also, there's, I think you can get into the details, and reasonable people can disagree, but I think there are aspects of our current pharmaceutical patent regulations that are needlessly ramping up the price of drugs. Finally, we have a massive misallocation of our population. We should have a lot more people living on our coasts than we do. In particular, we should have a lot more people living in greater New York City and greater San Francisco than we do. That's where, so over the past 30 or 40 years, the concentration of economic innovation and growth in big coastal cities with lots of college grads is a fact of the information economy. That put a lot of smart people in proximity to each other. That generates information spillovers that power modern information industries, and we see that. But at the same time that has occurred, at the same time that opportunity and dynamism are concentrating in particular parts of the country, those parts of the country have walled themselves off from people who want to come in and take advantage of these gold rushes, because of prohibitively expensive housing costs. So there's an economist at Berkeley, Enrico Moretti, who has calculated with a co-author, Sheh, at Chicago, that if the zoning regulations in New York, San Francisco, and San Jose, just those three municipal areas, was not laissez-faire, but at the median level of the U.S., that U.S. output today would be 10% higher than it is. That's a gobsmackingly large number for economist estimates of the cost of regulations. So I think we have the rent-seeking problem is not just yes, of course that's going on, but it's a problem that's getting worse. It's a problem that is significantly and materially hampering U.S. economic performance, and it's worse than that because, as I said, ultimately capitalism depends on the laws and policies that structure markets. Those laws and policies then in turn depend on a political system that is open to change and to reform if it gets things wrong. We're talking about self-government or democracy, but that isn't self-executing either. That can go away, and we're at a time now, not only here, but on the other side of the Atlantic, where there seems to be diminishing confidence in democratic government and increasing sort of interest in autocratic alternatives. And I think that there's a lot going on that is powering this sort of democratic reversal. But one thing that's going on is that the grease of the wheels of democratic government, which is economic growth, so that you can compromise in win-win ways, that grease is drying up when growth slows down. And politics, as economics gets more zero-sum, politics gets nasty zero-sum, negative-sum. So you can quibble with these stats, but the trend line is clear enough. Raj Chetty has calculated a decline in absolute mobility, the percentage of people who are doing better than mom and dad. For men born in 1940, by the time they were 30, 90% were doing better than dad. For men born in 1970, according to Chetty, only 50% by the time they were 30 were doing better than dad. Meanwhile, looking prospectively, on election night 2016, exit pollsters asked Americans, do you think your kids will be better off than you are? Only 30% said yes. Whether they're right or not, that level of pessimism is, I think, not irrelevant to the political commotion and the appeal of snake oil populism on both the left and the right that we're seeing today. If I could just bring it back to ethics, I think there's clearly political issues, and there's the way policymaking is done that can be changed to make our institutions less vulnerable to rent-seeking and to degradation. But in particular, the famous position by Milton Friedman that corporations have no corporate social responsibility other than to serve their shareholders is one that had an incredibly important caveat, so long as they operate within the existing laws. That general idea that you're supposed to serve your shareholders has then been sort of operationalized and quantified in terms of maximizing shareholder value, and within the constraint of existing laws, caveat has sort of dropped away. So that now corporate actors feel they have an obligation to their shareholders if there's a chance to go to Washington and make extra profits for their shareholders that way, then they are obligated to do that. That is a terribly wicked and self-destructive shift in the moral climate of business, and one step back towards reconstruction and renewal is an ethical shift along those lines that capitalism won't take care of itself without capitalists helping, or at least not actively conspiring in its destruction. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Brink. I remember Milton Friedman once saying he was in favor of markets but not business. And it's very, very similar kind of sentiment. Again, we have just a couple minutes for questions. How about the gentleman in the back here? Jim? And...
Thanks. So in my experience take a benign example, hairdressers or cosmetologists, while they have a lot of potential weapons at their disposal, razors, scissors, they've never used them to enforce the power of the little banner hanging on their mirror that says they're licensed by the state of Texas. They use the violence of the state to enforce that banner. So why not title the talk Capitalism's Achilles heel politicians?
So where do you think the occupational licensing statutes came from? Do you think politicians just sort of dreamed them up and started doing them? No, there was pressure from trade associations, pressure from groups, often a way to sort of raise status. Here's a lowly industry that people think of as kind of substandard. If we professionalize, if we license, if we get this government seal of approval, then we'll be seen as being sort of, a higher status line of work, and the added bonus that will be making it harder to have competitors come against us. So I think the impetus for a whole lot of regulatory activity is coming from the business community. Of course, it takes two to tango, so you need the politicians to go along with them or to come up with the ideas and sell them to the business community. But the idea that the business community is just trying to do its laissez-faire thing and having all these regulations imposed from Washington is a decidedly incomplete version of the facts.
Maybe we'll give our last, maybe second to last question to the famous Dennis McQuistion.
Yeah, famous, right. Thank you, Bob. Brink, the thing that's dealing with in the country today is Amazon, as an example, and this community is all over trying to give them everything, including at my university, at the University of Texas at Dallas. San Antonio has said, to hell with you. If you want to come here, we'd like to have you here. Where are we in terms of capitalist? You talked about lobbying to get something. We're asking for all these favors. Do we have an obligation to our shareholders to ask for or demand or whatever? And then what should we do as individuals to say, what in the hell are we thinking?
Thanks for raising this issue of development incentives to get corporations to locate in your state. That's another big racket. Let me plug here. The book that we've written, The Captured Economy, we now have a website, imaginatively titled CapturedEconomy.com, which is a kind of clearinghouse of academic research and journalistic analysis and news about policy developments in the 4 policy areas we're talking about. But we're planning to add other policy areas because this is just the tip of the iceberg. And the first one we want to add is targeted economic development incentives. I grant that it is unrealistic in the world we're living in for Jeff Bezos to say, you know, I can just see that there's jurisdictions just tripping over themselves to give me money. No, thank you. But what it will take ultimately is, so you really can't expect, it's unrealistic to expect individuals in particular industries to step back and not go to the trough. But we can expect other well-resourced people from other industries to see this as a larger systemic problem and add their voice to the voiceless diffuse interests that are getting rolled by rent-seeking regulation. So I think we have seen the way to beat, the only way to beat I don't know, how does the NRA slogan go? The way to beat a bad guy with money is a good guy with money. We've seen big policy developments tackling entrenched power in the past. We've seen the environmental movement, where previously polluting businesses, they were the big employer in their town. They ran they dominated policy discussions because of their impact and because of their size. Through a lot of philanthropy in the 60s and 70s, stood up this army of environmental groups and litigators and activists, and maybe too much, right? But so whether you think it's good or not, they absolutely balanced the playing field so that now when environmental issues are discussed, not only is the business's perspective taken into account, but the public interest in a clean environment is taken into account as well. Likewise, in education, previously teachers' unions sort of ran the shop, and who wants to be against teachers? But this school reform movement that's been backed with billionaire philanthropies, pushing towards, in particular, towards charters and other choice alternatives, has, through a huge philanthropic investment, leveled the playing field in the political debate. It would be wonderful to see that kind of effort devoted to the larger problem of rent-seeking.
Got promise for one very short last question and then a very short answer.
So businesses, we know, are not supposed to form conspiracies in restraint of trade. So I can't play golf with my buddies, but I can go to Washington and I can bribe some congressmen. So it strikes me that the problem that Reagan was trying to deal with, reducing regulation, requires that we limit the potential to form conspiracies in restraint of trade using government. Milton Friedman talked about various constitutional amendments. But what about some sort of changes in the constitutional structures that are available at all levels of government so that businesses cannot go to, it would be illegal for government to form that kind of regulation?
That is not a question susceptible to a brief answer. It's a very good question. So the obvious sort of libertarian answer to everything I've said is, well, if we didn't have all this regulation, we wouldn't have regulatory capture, and then we wouldn't have no problem. Clearly, that is going on. So I think for occupational licensing, I would like to see much less regulation. I'd like to see much less zoning, much less patent and copyright protection. So just deregulation will eliminate the incentives for rent seeking. However, there are areas where there are real externalities and real harms being caused in the environment and in safety issues where you're going to have a regulatory apparatus. Even if you don't like that, the way to get to your constitutional amendment to foreclose political activity is through three quarters of the states and super majorities in both houses of Congress. I I don't see public opinion lining up behind a complete elimination of the regulatory state anytime soon. So I think this is with us, and beyond that, we aren't doomed to the current level of dysfunction. You see across policy areas, across jurisdictions, across different agencies, across countries, enormous variations in the quality of government services. Some places, regulate economies with relatively little rent-seeking and relatively little corruption. Other places are just cesspools of rent-seeking and corruption. So I think even with a large regulatory state, we don't have to be as bad off as we are today. Just to make one quick point about how you can go through, how you can sort of filter your conspiracies and restraint of trade through Washington. One avenue for that has gotten narrowed down in the occupational licensing area. So there was dentists. They're licensed. They don't like competition. Teeth whitening kiosks in malls started opening up in North Carolina. The North Carolina Dentist Licensing Board sent cease and desist orders to the teeth whitening kiosks for the unauthorized practice of dentistry. But then they complained. Then the Federal Trade Commission told the North Carolina Dental Regulatory Board, cut it out with these cease and desist orders because what you're doing is in restraint of trade. And they say, hey, how can what we're doing be in restraint of trade? We're the government. We're a government regulatory body, and under sovereign immunity, we're immune from antitrust laws. And FTC said, well, that's a judge-made law, and its exact parameters aren't really clear, but it looks to me like your whole board is just a bunch of dentists, and and you don't have any supervisors, so I can't see any difference between you and a private body, so no sovereign immunity for you. Went up to the Supreme Court sided with the FTC. So exactly how big this loophole is, we're not clear yet, but there is some exciting possibilities for clamping down on occupational licensing by using the antitrust laws against actual anti-competitive behavior by government.
Fantastic. Thank you.